Hello and welcome to today's D-Hub MT YouTube channel podcast brought to you by European Digital Innovation Hub and powered by MDIA, Malta Digital Innovation Authority. Our guest speaker today is Mr. Alex Borg, who is the director of GBU. You have to continue with
Ventures. GBU Ventures.
GBU Ventures. Today we're going to talk about startups. In fact, one of Alex's notable achievements includes conceiving and executing Malta's pioneering idea to markup startup accelerator with a specific focus on emergent technologies. In this role, Mr. Borg evaluated over 600 startup projects, ultimately accelerating 32 of them, 10 of which collectively secured an impressive €55 million in funding. GBU Ventures, Alex, how did this come about?
Well, it started around 2014 when I was then a manager a consultant at Malta IT agency, MITA. And I was asked to come up with some ideas about an innovation center that they were planning, and I came up with the idea of a startup accelerator. I had never done it before. I mean, I come from a corporate experience, meaning working with projects, which have to work, when they especially when you implement projects in government. And you generally use top-down approaches, a great emphasis on planning, on risk mitigation. And then I discovered the world of startups, basically. I knew nothing about startups at the time. So I set about researching about, what are the best ways to create an innovation ecosystem, working initially with students, and then I got the idea of pushing it forward to support tech startups. And basically one of the great things was that we worked very, very fast, factoring in new ideas as we went along, and we delivered around 6 acceleration programs, 6 cohorts of startups.
Okay. So can you explain to us what is a tech startup and explain to us how the accelerator works?
Okay, so a tech startup essentially is, I like to use a definition which I like very much, which is from Eric Ries, who is the kind of the ideator of the lean startup methodology. A startup is a human institution working on a service or product in circumstances of extreme uncertainty. So a startup is not a hairdresser or a brick and mortar enterprise. Generally, a tech startup usually is a startup that wants to execute its idea using technology. So I hope, Now, what is an accelerator? In brief, an accelerator is, we can say that an accelerator is a school for startups. Rather than coaching each startup as you would in an incubator, maybe one at a time, you would batch them. That's why we call them a cohort.
Okay.
And you give them a limited time during which you have to kick ass, meaning that the program, you really have to deliver. You have a set of milestones to achieve. And it's also called the fail fast process, meaning that if you have to fail, you fail fast. Because the startup world is characterized by a very, very aggressive and Darwinistic approach, where only the best ones succeed.
Okay, so it can be brutal, but at the same time, obviously, it would pull the attention of what's happening to you fast, other than you fail slowly in time.
You waste a lot of money when you fail slowly.
Exactly, so it depends how you see it. It can be very brutal for the shock, but obviously it saves you a lot of time and money when you see it.
Rather than failing after a year or 2 years, you fail in 3 months.
What would you say are the most common seen barriers when it comes to tech startups?
I think one of the biggest barriers when starting up, is generally funding, access to funding, because very often you need that small amount of money to kickstart your operations, and that's all right. You can maybe rely on fools, family, and friends, they say. But nowadays, there are quite a few opportunities where you can maybe access that initial pre-seed funding. In Malta, for example, Malta Enterprise offers a special scheme for startups called the Business Start, which allows you to kind of kickstart, at least your initial proof of concept. But again, sometimes it's not that easy because obviously an entity like Malta Enterprise is ultimately managing taxpayers' money. It's public money, so they ask a lot of questions, there are a lot of checks. So sometimes it is not that easy for a startup to access. So then there are obviously private investors or business angels. That culture still needs to develop a bit more in Malta.
And putting the financial barrier aside, any other barriers you would highlight?
Well, access to talent is another one, because once the startup starts to to execute and the team starts to grow, accessing talent, good talent, is quite hard, because especially in Malta, where there's a big demand, not just Malta, everywhere really, there's a big demand for specialists, specialized people, especially in IT, developers who already earn quite a good salary. Attracting them and to your startup is difficult, because you have to offer them probably an even higher salary, because obviously working in a startup is very uncertain. So that is another challenge, I believe.
How would you say that some of these we can overcome? The financial, obviously by funding, but how can we overcome these barriers from your experience and from your ideas as well?
Obviously, I had a long experience in government, so and governments have a big role to play, at least government policies. Essentially, governments, through well-designed policies, can mitigate the risk of private investors, because basically when a startup kicks off, the success rate of that startup is usually very low. I mean, notoriously 5% of startups actually make it by the third year. So, but though it may seem very negative, in reality, governments have to understand, and sometimes governments struggle to understand this point, that there are many multipliers that are generated, economic multipliers. So the return really you get also from the 95% that fail. And the reason is that by the time a startup abandons its project, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the line, it will have created jobs, it will have recruited people, it will have created talent, generated IP, purchased services, and many other multipliers. Mm-hmm. So very often the return on the investment is not in the 5% that succeed, but in all of the startups basically, because for every euro you put in, you can get 6 or 7 euros in return from these multipliers. Governments tend to struggle to understand this.
Mm-hmm. What about initiatives like the Hub MT, powered by MDIA, when obviously they would seek out and leave this significant impact in the industry? How do you foresee this when it comes to startups?
The MDIA packs a number of very interesting services, especially the resources it can offer from the high performance computing, AI, 3D, and cybersecurity. It can make it pretty unique compared even to other accelerators, because generally accelerators tend to focus a lot on the business side, on the validation, on the investment. They also offer perks, but generally what are called perks in the startup world. Perks are usually like hosting, offered by big technology providers like Microsoft, Google, etc. So offering these resources is quite interesting, and it can make the ecosystem much more attractive for startups. And then running, of course, an accelerator program offering these services can give it a great opportunities.
How would you see and how can actually a tech startup adequately balance out the competition and the collaboration? Because while they would wish to collaborate, they would be maybe scared of the competition. So there's quite a balancing that has to happen there.
You're mentioning two things which are, competition is a necessary evil. But again, you have to analyze your competition. That's very, very important, especially that's something which I always emphasize. Competition really needs to be analyzed. But having said that, it's not only a threat, it's also what makes your product better. Because when you know that you have competitors, you have to work harder to make your product very, very unique, And with regard to collaboration is vital. It has its pitfalls, of course, because sometimes one of the biggest risks for startups is imitation, especially when the idea cannot be patented in some way. Then the risk of copying, of emulating that idea is quite high. So in that case, it's how fast you implement an idea or execute the idea. So you have to be a bit selective when you look for mentors or people who or with whom you share your idea. Having said that, however, startup founders should not be too hold their cards too tightly, because sometimes you have to talk to people to understand whether your idea really makes sense. So I think it's a balance. It's a delicate balance. You have to be selective. Not hold the cards too tightly to your chest. And of course, then there are NDAs you can use. You can, if you've got to a point where your secret source can be made known, then maybe you can resort to NDAs. There's a lot to be said about that anyway.
From your experiences with the startups, with the tech startups, what do you think their fears would mainly be, or their challenges would mainly be?
That's a good question. There are many fears, because when you make the jump and you become an entrepreneur, you have to cope with hesitation, you have to cope with risk, with even coming out into the open. So mental strength is very, very important, having mental strength.
I agree with you there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said on that front. I think that keeping it simple is very important, and that's another challenge when you're dealing with complex projects, especially with technology. And then you have to go and pitch it, and you have to pitch it in 5 minutes very often. And you have your narrative to build, a very good narrative to convince your investors to invest in you. And obviously, not everyone's an expert in your field, so you have to pitch it in a very, very simple way that's understandable. There's really a lot to be said on that front.
So if I had to obviously sum up, and we're almost at the end of our podcast, what would your message be to these tech startups? How would they execute? how to approach their product, the entrepreneurship, what would your advice be?
I think that the best way would be to start through, by applying for some acceleration program or joining an incubator, because accelerators and incubators help you validate your idea, and validation is key. Now there are lots of, you find accelerators everywhere. I think in Europe has around 500 accelerators. And many universities even have their own in-campus incubator. So I think that is a good start. And to approach it with some lightness, in the sense that, if it works, fine. If it doesn't work, you learn so much. You really learn a lot. So even if you go back to the industry after a failure, you're gonna be much better at what you do, and then you can even try again, because when you try again, you know what the pitfalls that you faced. So it's easier then to start, making less mistakes.
Super. Thank you for that. That was Alex Borg from GBU Ventures. Thank you for watching, and also for watching all our podcasts. We're meeting different guests each time. We're talking about AI, and we're bringing all this to you. So we do thank you, and we hope that you are enjoying these podcasts. Catch you next time.